Glass shattered against the mahogany wall, missing the butler's head by mere inches. Chicago's most feared underground king, Dominic Romano, was completely out of control. Rumours said no one could tame his violent outbursts until two desperate, identical sisters walked into his mansion and changed the criminal underworld forever. Silence was a rare and precious commodity in the Romano estate. A sprawling Gothic-style mansion tucked away in the heavily wooded enclaves of Lake Forest, Illinois. For the past 3 weeks, the house had been a war zone. Dominic Romano, the 32-year-old head of the Chicago outfit, was tearing his own empire apart from the inside out. Ever since a highly classified shipment of uncut diamonds from Antwerp was intercepted by the rival Lucchese faction, Dominic's legendary temper had escalated into a volatile, unpredictable inferno. Staff members were quitting in droves, terrified by the flying objects, the sudden roaring outbursts, and the heavy, suffocating aura of a man who trusted absolutely no one. Enter Harper and Haley Sullivan. At 23 years old, the identical twins had been stripped of their youth and forced into a corner by a father who loved the roulette wheel more than he loved his daughters. Arthur Sullivan, a mid-level accountant who had managed offshore accounts for the Romano family, had vanished, leaving behind a staggering debt of $750,000. The syndicate's enforcers had given the sisters a simple, brutal choice: pay the debt in blood or work it off in sweat. They chose the latter, signing their lives away as indentured domestic servants in the very belly of the beast. "You keep your eyes glued to the floorboards," whispered Mrs. Gable, the estate's veteran head housekeeper. She hastily shoved crisp, starched white aprons into the girl's hands. Her hands trembled slightly, a testament to the stress of managing a household for a ticking time bomb. "When Mr. Romano enters a room, you stop what you're doing. If he yells, you do not cry. If he throws something, you dodge and apologize for being in the way. Do you understand?" Harper, the older twin by 4 minutes, tightened her grip on the fabric of her apron. Her jaw set into a stubborn line, her striking hazel eyes flashing with suppressed defiance. "I understand that we are maids, Mrs. Gable, not target practice." Haley immediately placed a calming hand on her sister's shoulder, her demeanour the perfect counterbalance to Harper's fire. Where Harper was sharp edges and fierce independence, Haley was smooth waters and meticulous observation. "We understand, Mrs. Gable," Haley said softly, her voice an even, soothing melody. "We won't cause any trouble." Their first assignment was the Lion's Den itself, Dominic's private study on the 3rd floor. The heavy oak doors of the study were already ajar when Harper arrived with a silver cleaning cart. The scent of spilled bourbon and expensive Tom Ford cologne hung thick in the air. Inside, the room was a disaster. Books were thrown off the shelves, antique lamps were overturned, and at the centre of the chaos stood Dominic Romano. He was a terrifyingly handsome man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a tailored charcoal Brioni suit that looked severely out of place amidst the wreckage. His dark hair was dishevelled, and his knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of his massive mahogany desk, his chest heaving as he cursed at his underboss, Matteo Rossi. "I don't care if you have to burn the entire south side to the ground, Matteo." Dominic's voice was a deep, gravelly roar that rattled the crystal decanters remaining on the bar cart. "Find the rat. Find the man who leaked the shipment coordinates, or I will put a bullet in you myself." Matteo, a slick, sharp-featured man with predatory eyes, nodded hastily and practically sprinted out of the room, nearly knocking Harper over on his way out. Dominic didn't even notice her. He braced his hands on his desk, his head hung low, a low growl vibrating in his throat. He reached for a heavy crystal paperweight, fully intending to hurl it at the nearest window. "If you break that window, the draft is going to ruin the temperature in this room, and I highly doubt you want to freeze while you wallow in self-pity." A voice cut through the heavy silence. Dominic froze. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head. His dark, furious eyes locked onto Harper. He had explicitly ordered his staff to remain invisible, to cower, to never speak unless spoken to. Yet here was a petite maid, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun, looking him dead in the eye without a shred of fear. "Excuse me?" Dominic's voice was dangerously low, a lethal whisper. He dropped the paperweight, his hand instinctively resting over the concealed holster beneath his suit jacket. Harper didn't flinch. She pushed her cart into the room, her movements crisp and purposeful. "I said, breaking more things won't solve your shipment problem, Mr. Romano. It just creates more work for me, and frankly, I don't get paid enough to pick up glass all day. Actually, I don't get paid at all." Paid. Dominic stared at her, completely derailed. The raw, unadulterated fury that usually blinded him was suddenly pierced by a sharp spike of genuine shock. He took a menacing step toward her, towering over her small frame. "Do you have any idea who I am? I could end your life with a snap of my fingers." "I'm perfectly aware of who you are," Harper replied coldly, picking up an overturned lamp and righting it. "You're the man holding my father's debt over my head. Now, if you're done throwing your tantrum, I have a floor to vacuum." For 10 suffocating seconds, the room was silent. Dominic searched her face for a trace of the terror he was accustomed to seeing. There was none. Only a fiery, unyielding resilience. Something dark and completely foreign stirred in his chest. A muscle feathered in his jaw, and to his own profound astonishment, he didn't reach for his gun. He didn't scream. "Clean it up," Dominic finally muttered, his voice strained. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, leaving Harper alone in the wreckage, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had survived round 1. The next morning, the atmosphere in the mansion was unusually tense. Dominic had spent the entire night locked in his study, poring over syndicate ledgers and trying to track the missing money and the traitor within his ranks. The lack of sleep had given him a vicious headache, and the staff was tiptoeing through the halls like ghosts. At exactly 7 a.m, the heavy oak doors of the study opened without a sound. Dominic didn't look up from his paperwork, pressing 2 fingers to his throbbing temples. "I didn't ask for anyone. Get out." Footsteps, so light they were barely audible, crossed the Persian rug. A delicate china cup was placed gently on his desk, right next to his hand. The rich, dark aroma of a perfectly brewed double espresso wafted upward. Dominic paused. He hadn't asked for coffee, and even if he had, no one in the house knew exactly how he liked it. Black, with a single, microscopic drop of vanilla extract to cut the bitterness. He finally looked up, his dark eyes narrowing. Standing before him was the same Maid from yesterday. At least that's what he thought. "I told you to get out," he growled, though the heat was notably absent from his voice. Haley didn't offer a fiery comeback like her sister had. Instead, she offered a soft, almost imperceptible smile. Without a word, she reached out and gently adjusted a stack of chaotic, disorganized shipping manifests on his desk, perfectly aligning their edges. During her cleaning shift the previous night, she had noticed his tendency to group papers by dates rather than names. A subtle quirk she had seamlessly adapted to. "Your ledger from the 1994 offshore accounts was misfiled in the 1996 folder, sir," Haley murmured, her voice a quiet, soothing balm to his frayed nerves. "I took the liberty of placing it on top for your review. I believe the discrepancy you've been looking for is on page 42. Dominic's breath hitched. He stared at the girl. Just yesterday she had been a spitfire, challenging his authority and practically daring him to shoot her. Today she was a quiet, observant sanctuary, anticipating his needs and organizing his chaotic mind with an almost frightening precision. "You," Dominic started, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Yesterday you were ready to rip my throat out. Today you're bringing me coffee and auditing my books." Haley's smile widened just a fraction. "Harper handles the cleaning, Mr. Romano. I handle the organizing. I am Haley." Dominic sat back in his heavy leather chair, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Twins. Identical twins. He had vaguely recalled Matteo mentioning Arthur Sullivan had 2 daughters, but he hadn't cared enough to read their files. Now, looking at Haley, he realized the profound difference in their auras. Harper was the storm that matched his own rage, forcing him to ground himself lest they destroy each other. Haley was the calm after the storm, piecing together the wreckage with quiet brilliance. For the first time in years, the crushing, paranoid weight of his title felt a little lighter. He was utterly fascinated by them. But what Dominic didn't know was that the Sullivan twins were playing a highly dangerous coordinated game. They weren't just there to clean floors and serve coffee. They were there to clear their father's name. Later that evening, in the cramped, dimly lit servant quarters in the basement, Harper and Haley huddled over a stolen syndicate ledger. "He's falling for it," Harper whispered fiercely, pacing the small room. "When I push back, he doesn't lash out, he gets distracted. I kept him occupied in the library for 2 hours today arguing about turf logistics while you were in the West Wing." Haley was seated on her narrow cot, carefully transcribing numbers onto a notepad. "And it worked. I managed to slip into Matteo's suite while the guards were changing shifts. Harper, Dad didn't steal that money. The offshore accounts were completely drained, but the routing numbers correspond to shell companies registered under Matteo's maiden name in Sicily. Matteo is the rat. He framed Dad to cover his tracks." Harper stopped pacing, her eyes widening. "If Matteo is the rat and he finds out we know—" "We have to get this proof to Dominic," Haley said, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. "But we have to do it carefully. If Matteo suspects we're digging, we're dead." The stakes had instantly become a matter of life and death. The twins seamlessly integrated their strategy into their daily chores. Harper would deliberately agitate Dominic, drawing his attention and his fiery energy, keeping him localized in the main living areas. The banter between the Mafia boss and the sharp-tongued Maid became a daily ritual. The staff watched in stunned disbelief as Dominic Romano, a man who once broke a man's jaw for looking at him wrong, found himself leaning against door frames, smirking as Harper furiously dusted his antique bookshelves and lectured him on his temper. Meanwhile, Haley was a ghost. She moved through the mansion unseen, a silent shadow collecting fragments of truth. She memorized codes, noted the times Matteo left the estate, and meticulously built a bulletproof case against the underboss. But in the world of the Mafia, secrets have a rotting scent, and Matteo Rossi was a bloodhound. It happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. Haley had slipped into the laundry room to retrieve a set of freshly pressed linens for the guest wing, using the isolation to review a set of encrypted text messages she had copied from a burner phone left in Matteo's coat pocket. She didn't hear the door click shut. She didn't hear the footsteps over the hum of the industrial washing machines. Suddenly, a cold, calloused hand clamped over her mouth, yanking her violently backward against a hard chest. Haley thrashed, her eyes wide with terror as the cold, unforgiving steel of a stiletto blade was pressed tight against her throat, drawing a thin bead of crimson. "Snooping around my coat, little maid?" Matteo hissed in her ear, his breath hot and reeking of stale tobacco. "I knew there was something wrong with you two. Arthur's little brats coming here to play detective." Haley struggled, but his grip was like an iron vice. "I'm going to gut you right here," Matteo whispered, the blade pressing deeper, "and then I'm going to find your loudmouth sister and finish the job." Before Matteo could make another move, the heavy laundry room door was kicked off its hinges with a deafening crash. The metal door slammed against the tiled wall, buckling under the force. Standing in the doorway, framed by the dim hallway light, was Dominic Romano. In his right hand, his Beretta 92 FS was raised, the safety already flicked off, his eyes burning with a murderous rage that made his previous tantrums look like child's play. "Take the blade off her throat, Matteo." Dominic's voice was devoid of emotion, a terrifying hollow sound of a man promising absolute death. "Or I'll paint this room with your brains." Time suspended itself in the humid, claustrophobic air of the basement laundry room. Matteo Rossi's eyes darted wildly, the sharp stiletto trembling against Haley's pale skin. He was a seasoned killer, a man who had climbed the ranks of the Chicago outfit through ruthless cunning. But staring down the barrel of Dominic Romano's Beretta was an entirely different reality. "Put the gun down, boss," Matteo sneered, though his voice lacked its usual arrogant edge. "You don't understand what's happening here. These girls, they're rats. Arthur sent them to finish tearing us apart." Dominic did not blink. His posture was terrifyingly relaxed. the stance of a predator who had already calculated the exact trajectory of his kill. "I won't ask twice, Matteo. Drop the knife, or I drop you." "If I die, the Lucchese family takes over the entire port by midnight," Matteo shouted, desperately trying to leverage his treason. "I'm the only one holding the peace treaty together. Crack. The deafening roar of the gunshot echoed violently off the tiled walls, ringing in Haley's ears. Dominic hadn't aimed for Matteo's head. He had aimed with surgical precision for the underboss's right shoulder, shattering the clavicle and neutralizing his dominant arm. Matteo screamed, a guttural sound of pure agony, dropping the blade as he collapsed backward onto the concrete floor. Haley stumbled forward, gasping for air, her hands flying to her neck. Before she could fall, Dominic was there. The massive, terrifying Mafia boss caught the petite maid, his large hand gently inspecting the thin, bleeding scratch on her throat. "Are you all right?" Dominic's voice was shockingly tender, a stark contrast to the lethal violence he had just executed. Haley nodded shakily, tears finally spilling over her lashes. He knows we were looking into his accounts." "Haley!" Harper burst through the ruined doorway, a heavy brass candlestick clutched in her hands like a baseball bat. She took in the scene, Matteo writhing in a pool of blood, Dominic holding her sister, and immediately dropped the makeshift weapon, rushing to Haley's side. "I'm okay, Harp. I'm okay," Haley promised, pulling away from Dominic to embrace her twin. She quickly reached into her apron pocket, pulling out the small black burner phone she had risked her life to secure. She held it out to Dominic. "The routing numbers for the stolen Antwerp diamonds are in there. Matteo didn't just leak the shipment, Mr. Romano. He sold it to the Lucchese family, framed our father to cover his tracks, and used the offshore accounts to buy a private militia." Dominic took the phone, his jaw clenching so hard it looked as though his teeth might shatter. The betrayal of his right-hand man cut deep, but looking at the two young women who had risked absolutely everything to uncover it, his anger morphed into a cold, terrifying focus. "You two," Dominic ordered, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "Get behind me. We are leaving this wing right now." Matteo, gasping and clutching his bleeding shoulder, let out a wet, breathless laugh. "You're not going anywhere, Dominic. Do you really think I was just packing my bags? The Lucchese's, they aren't waiting for midnight." Right on cue, the mansion's power grid abruptly failed. The heavy hum of the industrial washing machines died instantly. The overhead fluorescent lights popped and sparked before plunging the room into absolute darkness. 3 seconds later, the estate's emergency generators kicked in, bathing the corridors in a low, pulsing crimson light. The estate was officially under siege. Chaos erupted on the floors above. The muffled sounds of shattered glass and heavy tactical gunfire echoed through the ventilation shafts, indicating that the Lucchese hit squads had breached the ground floor. Dominic grabbed the back of Matteo's collar, hauling the bleeding traitor to his feet and shoving him brutally into a heavy linen closet before locking it from the outside. "You can bleed out in there while I handle your new friends," Dominic spat. He turned to the twins. The situation was desperate. He had a dozen loyal guards on the premises, but a coordinated breach meant they were heavily outnumbered. "Mr. Romano," Harper said, her voice remarkably steady despite the chaotic gunfire above. She didn't cower. She stepped directly into his space, her hazel eyes locked onto his. "We can't go up the main staircase. It's a fatal bottleneck. If they breach the front doors, they already have snipers positioned on the second-floor landing." Dominic stared at her, genuinely impressed by her tactical assessment. "And how exactly does a maid know about fatal bottlenecks?" "I clean the second-floor landing," Harper shot back, a fiercely stubborn spark in her eye. "There's no cover. It's a suicide run." "She's right," Haley interjected, her mind racing as she processed the architectural blueprints of the mansion she'd memorized for her organizational duties. "But there's a dumbwaiter system in the West Wing kitchen that connects directly to your private armory on the 3rd floor. The blueprints show a servant's corridor that runs behind the walls of the grand dining room. It hasn't been used since the 1920s, but the doors are concealed behind the tapestries." Dominic couldn't help the dark, genuine smirk that tugged at his lips. He'd spent the last month raging at his highly trained enforcers, yet the key to his survival was standing in front of him in starched white aprons. "Lead the way, Haley," Dominic commanded, raising his weapon. The trio moved swiftly through the red-lit basement corridors. Haley was a ghost, gliding through the shadows and guiding them away from the heavy footsteps of the invading mercenaries. They slipped behind the massive velvet tapestry in the dining room, entering a narrow, dust-choked corridor that smelled of old wood and forgotten secrets. As they hurried through the tight space, Harper walked directly behind Dominic. She watched the broad lines of his back, the steady, practiced way he held his weapon. He wasn't the chaotic, raging monster she had met weeks ago. He was a protector. The heavy thud of boots directly on the other side of the wall forced them to freeze. Dominic pressed himself against the wood, instinctively reaching out and pulling Harper flush against his chest to keep her completely silent. His large hand clamped securely around her waist, pulling her out of the firing line. Harper's breath hitched. In the pitch-black corridor, pressed against the hardened muscle of the Mafia kingpin, the hostility that had defined their relationship suddenly melted into something dangerously electric. She could feel the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. He looked down at her, his dark eyes intense, silently communicating a promise. "I will not let you die tonight." When the footsteps faded, they moved quickly, finally reaching the third-floor armory. Dominic punched his biometric code into the heavy steel door, and it hissed open, revealing a terrifying arsenal of high-grade weaponry. Dominic immediately began strapping on a tactical vest and loading spare magazines into his belt. He tossed a heavy, modified Colt M1911 onto the steel table. "Harper," Dominic said, not looking up as he chambered a round into an assault rifle. "Take the Colt. The safety is on the left side. Aim for the center of mass." Haley gasped softly, but Harper didn't hesitate. She picked up the heavy firearm, her grip firm and resolute. "I need the access to the estate's security mainframe," Haley said quietly, stepping up to a massive computer terminal in the corner of the armory. "If Matteo gave them our blind spots, I can reprogram the security gates to lock down the perimeter. We can trap them inside the courtyard, cutting off their reinforcements." Dominic paused, staring at the quiet twin. "The security mainframe is encrypted with a rolling cipher. Even my tech guys struggle with it." Haley's fingers began flying across the keyboard with blinding speed. "Your tech guys don't spend 3 hours a day dusting your servers, Mr. Romano. I found the cipher key written on a sticky note under your router last Tuesday." A low chuckle vibrated in Dominic's chest. "When we survive this, I am firing my entire security detail." The final confrontation was a brutal, orchestrated symphony of violence. With Haley locking down the perimeter gates, the Lucchese reinforcements were trapped outside, entirely cut off from the hit squad inside the mansion. Dominic didn't wait for them to breach the third floor. He took the fight to them. "Stay here," Dominic ordered Harper, though he knew the stubborn woman wouldn't listen. He moved out into the grand hallway, engaging the first wave of assassins. He was a force of absolute nature, a lethal phantom moving through the shadows of his own home. He took down 3 men with terrifying efficiency, his movements sharp and unyielding. But as he reloaded behind a marble pillar, a 4th man hidden on the upper balcony trained a laser sight directly onto Dominic's chest. "Dominic, duck!" Harper's voice ripped through the air. She had followed him out, refusing to cower in the armory. Dominic dropped instinctively. Harper raised the heavy Colt M1911, her hands shaking only slightly, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil jolted her entire body, but the bullet found its mark, striking the sniper in the shoulder and sending him tumbling over the balustrade to crash onto the marble floor below. Dominic stared at Harper, his chest heaving. She lowered the smoking gun, her hazel eyes wide with adrenaline, her apron stained with soot and dirt. She had just saved the life of the most feared man in Chicago. By dawn, the estate was quiet. The remaining Lucchese men had surrendered once they realized they were trapped, and Dominic's loyal enforcers had secured the perimeter. Matteo Rossi had been dragged out of the linen closet and thrown into the trunk of a black SUV, destined for a one-way trip to a deep, unmarked grave in the Nevada desert. The morning sun filtered through the shattered windows of the grand foyer, casting long golden beams across the wreckage. Dominic stood in the centre of the destruction, wiping a smear of blood from his jaw. He looked at the two women sitting on the grand staircase. They were exhausted, battered, and absolutely magnificent. He walked slowly toward them, his heavy boots crunching softly on the broken glass. He stopped in front of Harper, reaching down to gently take the heavy colt from her trembling hands. "Arthur Sullivan's debt," Dominic said, his voice a low raspy rumble that filled the quiet space, "is officially marked as paid in full, with extreme interest." Hayley let out a choked sob of relief, burying her face in her hands. Harper, however, looked up at Dominic, her jaw setting into that familiar stubborn line. "So what happens now?" Harper asked, her voice tight. "Are we fired?" Dominic stepped closer, violating her personal space in a way that made her pulse skyrocket. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing a streak of dirt from her cheek. The touch was agonizingly tender, a stark contrast to the violence they had just survived. "You're not Maids anymore," Dominic stated, his eyes burning with a possessive dark heat that made Harper's breath catch. "You belong to this family now, not as servants, as partners." He glanced at Hayley, who was watching them with a soft, knowing smile. "Hayley is taking over my logistical operations. She's smarter than my entire command staff combined." Dominic's gaze shifted back to Harper, dropping to her lips before meeting her eyes again. "And you?" "And me?" Harper challenged, though her voice was little more than a breathless whisper. "You're going to stay exactly where you are," Dominic murmured, closing the distance between them until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "Right by my side, because God help me, Harper Sullivan, you are the only person in this godforsaken city who can handle me." He leaned down, and Harper met him halfway. The kiss was explosive, a collision of fire and dominance sealing a dangerous, unbreakable pact. The king of the underground had found his queen, and her sister had become the architect of his new empire. No one could handle the angry Mafia boss, but the Sullivan twins didn't just tame him, they conquered his entire world. Did Harper and Hayley bite off more than they can chew with the Romano Syndicate? If you were captivated by this dangerous dance with Chicago's most ruthless Mafia boss, hit that like button. Share this intense drama with your friends, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for the epic conclusion in parts 3 and 4. The twists are only getting darker, and you won't want to miss Dominic's next move. Drop a comment with your favourite twin,